The tiny, warm fingers of Seo-Yun pressed against the cold, ink-black dragon coiling up Kang Jae-Hwan's neck. "No, Seo-Yun, let go!" Monica's mind screamed, but her body was paralyzed. Her hand flew to her mouth, the metallic taste of terror coating her tongue as she watched her daughter's soft brown skin contrast against the boss's sharp, black suit. The foyer, usually silent as a tomb, felt like it was vibrating with the force of Jae-Hwan's shock. One wrong move, one loud breath, and the fragile secret Monica had guarded for a year would come crashing down around them. She had been a ghost in this mansion for 6 months. 6 months of polishing silver for a man who didn't know she existed. 6 months of keeping her head down and her natural hair tucked back, playing the role of the perfect, faceless maid in a gray uniform. 6 months of pretending she didn't know exactly what the Ice King was capable of. Monica had thought she could hide the truth forever, that she could raise Seo-Yun in the shadows of the very man whose blood ran through the infant's veins. She thought she was safe. She thought wrong. The foyer of the Kang estate was a cathedral of cold marble and silent intimidation, a place where Monica Reed usually moved like a shadow. She adjusted the weight of 11-month-old Seo-Yun against her hip, the fabric of her gray maid's uniform feeling uncomfortably stiff against her skin. She had intended to slip through the side corridor before the master of the house returned, but the heavy oak doors swung open with a finality that rooted her to the spot. Kang Jae-Hwan stepped into the light, a storm wrapped in a perfectly tailored black suit. He was the Ice King of Seoul's underworld, a man whose reputation for controlled violence was written in the faint scar lines on his cheek and the intricate black tattoos that snaked up his neck, vanishing beneath his crisp white collar. His presence usually sent the staff scattering like roaches, but Monica stood paralyzed as his sharp, dark eyes swept the room, eventually landing on her. In that heartbeat of silence, Seo-Yun did the unthinkable. The baby, oblivious to the lethal power radiating from the man before her, let out a soft, gurgling sound of curiosity. Her tiny, brown hand reached out, escaping Monica's protective hold, and pressed firmly against Jae-Hwan's cheek, her fingers brushing the mythic creature tattooed into his skin. Monica's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of pure terror. Her hand flew to her mouth, clamping over her lips as if to physically hold back the scream building in her throat. She had spent a year guarding the secret of Seo-Yun's bloodline, working as a faceless servant to keep the child hidden in the very heart of the dragon's den. Now, that secret felt as fragile as the infant's grip. Jae-Hwan didn't recoil. He didn't lash out. Instead, he froze. His disciplined, rigid posture cracked as his eyes widened, his lips slightly parting in an expression of genuine, unfiltered shock. The man who commanded an empire built on fear was being disarmed by a palm that didn't even cover the width of his jaw. He looked down at the child, his arms instinctively shifting as if to secure her, even as his mind clearly struggled to process the intimacy of the gesture. The contrast was a visual and emotional paradox. The pure, innocent eyes of the child staring straight into the battle-tested, merciless gaze of the monster. Monica watched, breathless, as a flicker of something unreadable, something dangerously close to recognition, crossed Jae-Hwan's face. She leaned back slightly, caught in the gravity of a moment that felt like a shift in the Earth's axis. She had thought she could play the ghost forever, raising her daughter in the safety of the shadows. But as Jae-Hwan remained motionless, his breath hitching as Seo-Yun patted his scarred face with instinctive trust, Monica knew the peace of the last 6 months was dead. The secret was out, or at least its tail was visible, and as the Ice King stared at her daughter, Monica realized with a cold shiver that their lives had just been irrevocably rewritten. The man who saw only pawns or enemies was looking at her child, and for the first time, the monster looked almost human. The transition from the basement servant quarters to the penthouse of the Kang estate felt less like a promotion and more like being moved into a gilded cage. Monica clutched Soon's diaper bag, her knuckles white, as the private elevator ascended to the top floor, a level of the mansion she had previously only seen when scrubbing the baseboards under the watchful, suspicious eyes of the head housekeeper. The air up here was different. It was thin, expensive, and heavy with a predatory silence. Kang Jae-Hwan was waiting for her in an office that overlooked the glittering, jagged skyline of Seoul. He had shed his suit jacket, his crisp white sleeves rolled up to reveal more of the ink that marked him as a king of the underworld. He didn't look at Monica at first. His gaze was fixed on Seo-Yun, who was currently occupied with chewing on the collar of Monica's gray uniform. The Ice King didn't speak until Monica had taken the seat he indicated, a plush leather chair that cost more than her university tuition. "You are no longer part of the cleaning staff," Jae-Hwan said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the fine hairs on Monica's neck stand up. He slid a folder across the mahogany desk. It contained a contract for the position of house manager, a title that Monica knew was a thin veil for something far more complex. The salary listed was an impossible number, enough to pay off her debts and secure Seo-Yun's future 10 times over. But in this world, money always came with a blood-soaked price. Her new responsibilities were vague but total. Managing his private schedule, screening his personal communications, and, most importantly, remaining by his side during internal meetings. She was to be his shadow, a witness to the workings of an empire built on fear. Monica's throat felt tight as she realized what this meant. She was being pulled from the relative safety of the shadows and thrust into the center of the dragon's nest. As she was led to her new living quarters, a sprawling suite with floor-to-ceiling windows and a nursery already stocked with high-end cribs, the whispers began. The other maids, women who had been her only friends in this cold city, now turned their heads away when she passed. She saw the sharp, sidelong glances and heard the hissed rumors in the corridors. To them, she was the black maid who had used her child to bewitch the boss. They didn't see a mother trying to survive. They saw an opportunist who had successfully climbed the marble stairs. Monica locked the door of her new apartment, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the vast space. She sat on the edge of the silk-covered bed and pulled Seo-Yun into her lap, burying her face in the baby's soft, sweet-smelling hair. The secret she carried felt heavier than ever. Jae-Hwan had promoted her because he saw something in Seo-Yun that called to a ghost in his own past. But if he ever discovered the full truth of the bloodline that connected them, the promotion to peril would become a death sentence. She was no longer scrubbing floors, but the dirt she was now standing in was far more dangerous. The nursery, once a minimalist extension of the cold penthouse, had been transformed overnight into a chaotic museum of childhood. Crates stamped with the logos of Seoul's most exclusive boutiques lay half-emptied across the plush cream carpet. There were hand-carved rocking horses, interactive digital learning centers, and a mountain of silk-furred stuffed animals that seemed to watch the room with glassy, unblinking eyes. Kang Jae-Hwan stood in the center of the wreckage, looking less like a benefactor and more like a man navigating a minefield. He was still dressed in his signature black suit, the silk tie loosened just enough to reveal the base of the dragon tattoo coiling up his throat. In his large, scarred hand, he held a delicate porcelain music box, as if he were checking it for a wire. Monica watched from the doorway, her breath hitching as she saw the Ice King of the underworld crouched on one knee, staring intensely at a plush rabbit. Her own appearance had shifted. Though her hair was still styled simply, she felt the weight of her new role as she stepped out of the shadows. "It does not perform," Jae-Hwan observed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. He poked the rabbit's stomach with a calloused finger, his brow furrowed in the same way it might be during a hostile business negotiation. "You have to squeeze the paw, sir," Monica whispered, stepping forward. She kept her distance, mindful of the invisible line that still separated a maid-turned-shadow from the man who owned her city. Jae-Hwan followed the instruction with a mechanical precision that would have been comical if he weren't so terrifying. The rabbit began to play a tinkling, high-pitched lullaby. He stared at it, his expression frozen in a mixture of confusion and profound awkwardness. For a man who understood the mechanics of a Glock and the intricacies of money laundering, the simplicity of a toy seemed to baffle him. He was a master of the underworld, yet he didn't know how to play. Seo-Yun, however, had no such reservations. She crawled across the carpet with determined speed, her light-colored baby outfit a bright spot against the dark fabric of Jae-Hwan's trousers. She reached his knee and pulled herself up, her tiny, soft hands gripping the expensive wool of his suit for balance. She looked up at the scarred, tattooed face above her with big, expressive eyes full of innocent curiosity. Duh, she chirped, reaching for the music box. Monica's heart skipped a beat. The word was a baby's babble, a random syllable, but in this room, with this man, it felt like a detonator. She braced herself for Jae-Hwan to pull away, to remember the cold distance his position demanded. Instead, he reached out, his hand, etched with symbols of power and violence, steadying the child's wobbly frame. Seo-Yun didn't take the toy. Instead, she reached up and grabbed Jae-Hwan's thumb, pulling his hand toward her face. She let out a peal of pure, infectious laughter, a sound that seemed to shatter the sterile silence of the penthouse. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, an intimate and instinctive gesture of absolute, unearned trust. Then it happened. The mask that had defined Kang Jae-Hwan for a decade finally slipped. The corners of his mouth, usually set in a hard, uncompromising line, twitched upward. The Ice King didn't just crack, he thought. It wasn't a practiced, political smirk, but a genuine, lopsided smile that reached his eyes, softening the harsh edges of his scars. Monica stared, a hand clamped over her heart in disbelief. She was witnessing a miracle, but as she watched the most dangerous man in Korea trade his weapons for a rattle to amuse her daughter, a cold shiver of reality washed over her. Jae-Hwan was rediscovering his humanity through Seo-Yun, but his world was built on the absence of it. The more he loved the child, the more dangerous Monica's secret became. If the syndicates saw this smile, they wouldn't see a father, they would see a target. The transition from maid to shadow meant Monica now sat in the corners of rooms where the fate of Seoul's shipping docks was decided. To the men in sharp suits who sat across from Kang Jae-Hwan, she was a decorative curiosity, a black American woman with a child who had somehow gained the Ice King's favor. They looked through her as if she were still a ghost in a gray uniform. And that was their first mistake. During a tense negotiation with a sub-faction from the docks, Monica noticed the poison. It wasn't in the tea, though her eyes instinctively tracked the steam rising from the porcelain cups. It was in the silence of the household staff. In her months scrubbing the floors of the mansion, Monica had learned the language of the Kang estate's underbelly. She knew the rhythm of the kitchen, the specific cadence of the head housekeeper's footsteps, and the exact scent of the cleaning solvents used in the private study. As she stood behind Jae-Hwan, with Seo-Yun sleeping soundly in the on-site nursery, Monica felt a shift in the atmosphere. A new server, a man she had never seen in the basement quarters, approached with a fresh pot of oolong. To anyone else, he was just another faceless employee. To Monica, he was a variable that didn't belong. He placed the pot down with a tremor in his grip, a minute vibration that only someone who had carried thousands of trays would recognize as nerves. "Sir," Monica whispered, leaning down. Her breath caught as she caught the scent on the server's sleeve, not the lemon pine of the estate's cleaning supply, but the harsh metallic sting of a rival syndicate's preferred industrial grease. Jae-Hwan didn't move, but she felt his rigid body go even tighter. "What is it?" he murmured, his eyes never leaving the dock representative across from him. "The tea service," Monica said, her voice a barely audible thread. "The man is not from your kitchen, and the pot is heavy in the wrong places." Jae-Hwan's hand, the one etched with the dragon's tail, reached out. He didn't take the tea. Instead, he gripped the server's wrist with the speed of a striking viper. The porcelain pot hit the mahogany table with a dull, heavy thud that proved it was no ordinary vessel. The room erupted as Jae-Hwan's security moved in a blur of black silk and drawn steel. Within seconds, the server was on the floor, and the lid of the teapot was pried open to reveal not tea leaves, but a high-frequency jamming device and a localized recording unit intended to poison Jae-Hwan's influence. The silence that followed was deafening. Jae-Hwan looked at the device, then up at Monica. He had been so focused on the predators in front of him that he had forgotten to watch the shadows behind him. "Ow," he asked quietly, the tension in the room thick enough to choke. "You don't notice the wallpaper until it changes," Monica said, using her knowledge of the household to protect him. "I was the wallpaper for 6 months. I know when a new pattern is being forced." Jae-Hwan stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the room. For the first time, He didn't just see the mother of a child who had charmed him. He saw a partner. "It seems," Jae-Hwan said, his voice dropping to a deadly, satisfied hum, "that my shadow has sharper eyes than my soldiers." He reached out, his thumb grazing the scar on his cheek as he studied her. Monica realized that her knowledge of the household was the most dangerous weapon in the building. She was no longer just a maid. She was becoming indispensable. The scent of expensive cigars and old blood preceded Boss O into the penthouse. As the leader of the rival Bususan syndicate, he was a man who had survived decades by scenting weakness in the air before it ever manifested in action. He sat across from Kang Jae-Hwan, his elderly eyes hidden behind thick, tinted glasses, while his own soldiers stood like statues against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Monica stood in her designated place behind Jae-Hwan's shoulder. She had traded her gray maid's uniform for a sleek, dark dress that allowed her to blend into the mahogany shadows of the room. But she felt more exposed than ever. On the desk, tucked just out of the rival boss's direct line of sight, was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, one of the toys Jae-Hwan had bought for Seo-Yun. It was a tiny, colorful splinter in the middle of a world of cold steel and dark ink. The negotiation was a brutal game of chess regarding the territorial rights to the Incheon docks, but Jae-Hwan was playing with a split mind. His gaze, usually a fixed and terrifying weight, kept flickering just for a fraction of a second toward the silent security monitor on the corner of his desk. On that small screen, Monica knew, was the live feed of the nursery where Seo-Yun was currently napping under the watchful eye of Ms. Hang. Bosso paused mid-sentence, his wrinkled hands resting on his cane. He didn't look at the docks map. He looked at Jae-Hwan. "You are quiet today, King of Seoul," the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Your mind is like a bird that wants to fly out the window. Tell me, what has captured the attention of a man who usually sees only the throat of his enemy?" "My mind is where it has always been." "Oh," Jae-Hwan replied, his voice a flat, dangerous monotone. But as he spoke, his thumb unconsciously traced the edge of the wooden bird toy. Monica felt a chill wash over her. She saw Boss O's eyes shift. They didn't land on her face. They landed on the toy, then on the monitor, and finally on Monica herself. The old man's lips thinned into a predatory smile. He had spent 50 years studying the bloodlines of the underworld, and he possessed a memory for faces that was legendary. "I heard a rumor," Boss O continued, leaning forward, "that the dragon had taken an estray, a maid from the West, and a child." He turned his tinted glasses toward Monica, and she felt as if a cold needle were being driven into her chest. The girl, Seo-Yun, I believe, such a traditional name for a child with such a unique heritage. The temperature in the room plummeted. Jae-Hwan's hand stopped moving. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with the sudden tension in his jaw. "The child is under my protection. That is all you need to know." "Protection is a heavy burden," Bosso whispered. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking in the silence. As he passed the desk to exit, he paused, leaning in to catch a glimpse of the monitor. His eyes narrowed. He saw the curve of Seo-Yun's sleeping face, the shape of the nose, the specific arc of the brow that looked hauntingly like a ghost from Jae-Hwan's own family tree. "She has the eyes of a Kong," the old man murmured, loud enough only for those in the inner circle to hear. "The secret you think you're guarding is already leaking, Jae-Hwan, and blood that is spilled in the shadows always finds its way to the light." As a rival syndicate filed out, Monica looked at Jae-Hwan. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were wide, the shock from their first meeting in the foyer returning with a vengeance. The Ice King wasn't just distracted, he was terrified. The secret of Seo-Yun's lineage wasn't just a threat to Monica anymore. It was a scent of blood and water filled with sharks. The penthouse was submerged in a restless, indigo twilight, the only light coming from the glowing grid of the city below. Monica had retreated to the nursery to soothe a restless Seo-Yun, leaving the master suite in a heavy, expectant silence. Jae-Hwan stood by the window, his reflection a dark specter against the glass. Boss O's parting words, "She has the eyes of a Kong," had acted like a corrosive acid, eating away at the logic he used to keep his world in order. He turned toward the small side table where Monica's personal belongings had been placed during her transition to house manager. He knew it was a violation. He knew that as a man of honor, even a dark one, he should respect the privacy of the woman who had saved his life from a poison tea service. But the hunger for the truth was a physical ache in his chest. His hand, scarred and steady, reached for a small, leather-bound journal tucked inside her bag. As he lifted it, a single, dog-eared photograph slipped from between the pages and drifted to the marble floor. Jae-Hwan knelt to retrieve it. The moment his eyes locked onto the image, the air seemed to leave the room. It was an old photo, the edges softened by time and frequent handling. In it, a younger man stood laughing against the backdrop of a neon-lit Seoul street. He was lean, charismatic, and lacked the tattoos that now defined Jae-Hwan, but the resemblance was undeniable. It was Jae-Hwan's younger brother, Ji-Hoon, the one who had supposedly disappeared into the military and then into the void of the West years ago. But Ji-Hoon wasn't alone in the photo. He had his arm wrapped around a radiant, younger Monica. They looked at the camera with a profound, terrifying hope that Jae-Hwan hadn't seen in a decade. His gaze traveled from his brother's face to the infant currently sleeping in the next room. The puzzle pieces didn't just fit. They locked together with a violent snap. The specific arc of the brow, the stubborn set of the jaw, the way Seo-Yun had reached for him in the foyer with a familiarity she shouldn't have possessed. It wasn't just instinct. It was blood. He called you his moonlight, a soft, trembling voice said from the doorway. Jae-Hwan didn't look up. He couldn't. He stared at the ghost of the brother he thought he had lost to the world's indifference. Ji-Hoon, he whispered, the name sounding like a prayer and a curse. He told me about his brother, Monica said, stepping into the room. She looked small in the vastness of the suite, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The brother who stayed behind to build a throne so Ji-Hoon could be free. He was coming back for you, Jae-Hwan. He wanted to bring us home. But the accident. He never got the chance to tell you about her. Jae-Hwan finally stood, the photograph trembling slightly in his grip. The shock that had frozen him in the foyer weeks ago was nothing compared to the tidal wave of grief and realization crashing over him now. He wasn't just protecting a maid's baby. He was holding the last living piece of his own heart. You knew, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, wounded low. You worked in my house, cleaned my floors, and watched me every day, knowing she was my niece. I knew your reputation, Monica countered, her voice gaining a desperate strength. I knew the Ice King. I didn't know if you would see her as a blessing or a liability. I had to know if you were a man or a monster before I told you the truth. Jae-Hwan looked back at the photo, then at the woman who had braved the lion's den to keep his brother's legacy alive. The secret was no longer leaking. It was a flood. And as he looked at the ghost of his brother, he realized that the promotion to peril had just become a war for his own bloodline. The air in the master suite was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of a confrontation long overdue. Jae-Hwan stood like a monolith, the photograph of Ji-Hoon still clutched in his hand as if it were a holy relic. His eyes, usually as unreadable as obsidian, were now swirling with a volatile mix of betrayal and agonizing hope. A liability? Jae-Hwan's voice was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate the very floor beneath Monica's feet. He took a step toward her, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe in the dim light. You let me believe you were a stranger. You let me treat the blood of my blood as a servant's accidental burden. Do you have any idea what Ji-Hoon was to me? Monica didn't flinch. She took a step forward instead, her chin tilting upward in a display of maternal iron that matched his underworld steel. I know exactly what he was to you, she said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. He was the reason you became this. He was the light you protected by staying in the dark. And that is exactly why I stayed silent. Jae-Hwan stopped, his jaw tightening until the muscle twitched against his scar. Explain yourself. Ji-Hoon loved you, but he was terrified for you, Monica said, her eyes shimmering with the memory of the man they had both lost. He told me that being a Kang meant having a target on your back from the moment you're born. He wanted Seo-Yun to have a life where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. If I had walked in here 6 months ago and told you the truth, what would you have done? You would have turned her into a princess in a fortress. You would have surrounded her with men and guns and the very violence Ji-Hoon died trying to escape. I would have given her the world, Jae-Hwan hissed. You would have given her your world, Monica corrected. A world where Basso looks at her and sees a weakness to be exploited. A world where tea is poisoned and every shadow holds a blade. I didn't want the Ice King's protection for her, Jae-Hwan. I wanted a life for her. She took another step, closing the distance until she could see the fine lines of grief around his eyes. This was the precipice. The truth could be the bridge that finally brought them together, or it could be the spark that ignited a war within the syndicate. If Jae-Hwan claimed her as his niece now, the rivals would move in for the kill before the sun rose. I had to know if there was any of Ji-hoon left in you, she whispered. I had to see if you could love her without owning her. If I tell the world who she is, Jae-Hwan, she becomes the most hunted child in Korea. Is that the freedom you want for your brother's daughter? Jae-Hwan looked down at the photo, his thumb grazing the image of his brother's laughing face. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Monica realized she had placed their lives in the hands of a man who had spent a decade suppressing every human impulse. Finally, Jae-Hwan looked up. The coldness hadn't returned, but a new, fiercer light had taken its place. He reached out, not to strike or to push, but to reclaim the photo with a reverent care. She is a Kang, he said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a vow. And you are right. My world is a cage. But if you think I will let my brother's legacy live in the shadows of a maid's quarters for one more second, you are mistaken. The truth will stay between us for now, Monica. But from this moment on, you are not my shadow. You are the mother of the only thing that matters in this city. The choice had been made. The truth had set them free from the lie, but it had tethered them to a new, more dangerous reality. They were no longer master and servant. They were co-conspirators in a game where the stakes were Seo-Yun's life. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a shimmering ocean of silk, champagne, and whispered treachery. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the gilded ceiling, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the elite of Seoul's underworld. Monica stepped into the fray, her heart a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. She was no longer dressed in the humble gray of a maid or the inconspicuous dark tones of a personal assistant. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her curves and deepened the rich tone of her skin, her natural hair styled in an elegant, structured crown. Beside her, Kang Jae-Hwan was a pillar of lethal elegance. His black tuxedo was so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin, the dragon tattoo on his neck peeking out above his stiff collar like a warning to those who dare get too close. He didn't offer her his arm. That would be too much of an admission, but he moved with a proprietary closeness that signaled to the room that she was under his personal aegis. Keep your head up, Jae-Hwan murmured, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the string quartet. In this room, fear is a scent. If they smell it, they will hunt you. I'm not afraid for myself, Monica replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. I'm thinking about the nursery. Ms. Hang has 3 armed men at the door and a direct line to my private security, Jae-Hwan assured her, though his own eyes flickered toward the entrance of the ballroom, scanning for threats. Seo-Yun is the safest soul in this city tonight. Focus on the monsters in front of you. The gala was a traditional display of power, a place where alliances were forged in the clink of crystal and broken with a single look. Monica felt the weight of 100 gazes. To the syndicate leaders, she was a riddle they couldn't solve. The Black Lady, who had appeared at the Ice King's side, seemingly out of nowhere. She watched the way their eyes traveled from her face to Jae-Hwan's, searching for a weakness, a crack in the armor. As they navigated the room, Monica utilized the skills she had honed in the shadows of the mansion. She didn't just listen to the words. She watched the body language. She noticed the way a rival lieutenant's eyes narrowed when Jae-Hwan turned his back, and the specific, nervous way a corrupt politician adjusted his cufflinks when the topic of the Incheon docks was raised. She was Jae-Hwan's secret weapon, the observer who knew how to read the wallpaper of high society. Suddenly, the crowd parted, and Boss O appeared, leaning heavily on his cane, his tinted glasses reflecting the ballroom's glare. He looked at Monica, a slow, yellowed smile spreading across his wrinkled face. A stunning transformation, Ms. Reed, the old man rasped. From the dirt of the foyer to the velvet of the gala. Jae-Hwan, You have a talent for finding diamonds in the rough. She is no diamond. Oh, Jae-Hwan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy low as he stepped slightly in front of Monica. She's the edge of my blade. Don't forget that. Baso chuckled a dry, rattling sound. A blade is only useful if the hand holding it is steady. I wonder if the nursery is as quiet as this ballroom is loud. The threat hung in the air, invisible and suffocating. Monica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked at Jae-Hwan and saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. The Gala of Shadows wasn't just a party, it was a distraction. While they were here, playing the part of the powerful and the unbothered, the real war was being fought in the silence of the estate. Monica realized then that her dress was a uniform just as much as her maid's outfit had been, a disguise meant to draw the fire away from the child who carried the future of the Kang bloodline. The gala was still a blur of velvet and whispers when the black phone in Monica's clutch vibrated with a jagged, rhythmic pulse, the emergency signal from the estate. She didn't need to check the screen. The blood drained from her face, her midnight blue gown suddenly feeling like a shroud. Across the ballroom, her eyes locked with Jae-Hwan's. In that single, silent second, the Ice King vanished, replaced by a man possessed by a primal, terrifying urgency. He didn't say a word. He simply turned toward the exit, his stride breaking into a predatory run. But Monica was already moving. While Jae-Hwan's security team scrambled to clear a path through the panicked socialites, she was thinking of the layout of the penthouse, the service ducts she had once scrubbed, the hidden vents that only a maid would know. By the time they reached the armored SUV, the city was a smear of neon light. They bypassed the perimeter. Jae-Hwan hissed, his hands white-knuckled on his weapon. Oh, didn't send soldiers. He sent ghosts. The estate was eerily dark when they arrived. The iron gates had been forced, and the silence that hung over the marble driveway was the silence of a graveyard. Monica didn't wait for the vehicle to stop. She threw herself out of the door, her silk heels snapping as she hit the pavement. She tore them off, running barefoot across the cold stone toward the private elevator. "Monica, stay back," Jae-Hwan shouted, but she was already gone, fueled by a maternal desperation that defied his authority. She reached the penthouse via the service stairs, her lungs burning. The nursery door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, the dragon's nursery was a wreck of splintered wood and torn silk. Ms. Hang lay unconscious near the crib, a dark bruise blooming on her temple, but the crib itself was empty. A shadow moved in the corner of the darkened suite. A man in gray tactical gear was retreating toward the balcony, a crying, terrified Seo-Yun clutched in one arm. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for a ransom. "Drop her," Monica said, her voice a low, lethal snarl. She stood in the center of the room, her elegant gown torn and stained, her eyes glowing with a ferocity that stopped the kidnapper in his tracks. The man sneered, pulling a combat knife. "Get back, maid. This child is worth more than your life." "She is my life," Monica whispered. She didn't use a gun. She reached in the pocket of her gown and pulled out the heavy, sharpened letter opener she had slipped from Jae-Hwan's desk earlier that evening. As the man lunged, Monica didn't move like a lady of society. She moved like a woman who had survived the harshest corners of the world. She dodged the blade, the velvet of her dress whistling in the air, and drove the steel into the man's shoulder. He roared, his grip loosening. Monica caught Seo-Yun as they tumbled to the floor, shielding the baby's body with her own. The kidnapper recovered, raising his knife for a killing blow, but the balcony doors exploded inward. Kang Jae-Hwan didn't just enter the room. He reclaimed it. The roar that tore from his throat was nothing human. He moved in a blur of black silk and ink-black rage, his hands, the same hands that had awkwardly held a music box, now delivering a brutal, final justice. When the silence returned, it was heavy and absolute. Jae-Hwan stood over the fallen intruder, his chest heaving, his suit jacket ruined. He turned slowly, his eyes wild and bloodshot, searching the wreckage. He found him on the floor behind the ruined rocking horse. Monica was curled in a ball, her arms wrapped so tightly around Seo-Yun that the child was almost hidden. She was shaking, her bare feet bleeding, but when she looked up at him, her gaze was unbroken. Jae-Hwan dropped to his knees, pulling them both into his chest. The dragon had returned to find his treasure safe, but as he felt Seo-Yun's tiny heartbeat against his own, he knew the breach had changed everything. The secret was dead. The war had truly begun. The morning sun rose over Seoul, bleeding gold across the shattered glass of the penthouse balcony. The estate was crawling with Jae-Hwan's most loyal soldiers, a silent army scrubbing the remnants of the night's violence from the marble floors. But the atmosphere had shifted. The terror that usually followed a breach had been replaced by a heavy, reverent anticipation. Inside the study, Kang Jae-Hwan stood before a tall mirror, buttoning a fresh white shirt. His movements were slow, deliberate. The dragon on his neck seemed to glow in the dawn light, but his eyes were no longer those of a man looking for an enemy. He was a man preparing for a coronation. Monica sat on the velvet sofa nearby, her feet bandaged, watching him as she rocked a sleeping Seo-Yun. The blue gala dress was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant hanbok, a gift from Jae-Hwan that signaled a status no maid could ever claim. "The syndicate is waiting," Jae-Hwan said, his voice a calm, resonant chime in the quiet room. "Boss O has called an emergency meeting of the council. He thinks the breach was his victory. He thinks he has found my Achilles heel." "And has he?" Monica asked softly. Jae-Hwan turned, looking at the woman and child who had dismantled his frozen world. He walked over and knelt before them, his large, tattooed hand coming to rest gently on Seo-Yun's small back. "He has found my heart," he whispered. But he forgot that a heart is what gives a dragon its fire. The council chamber was located in the belly of a fortress-like skyscraper downtown. All the major heads of the Seoul underworld were present, their faces grim, their eyes searching for any sign of weakness in the Ice King. Basso sat at the head of the long table, a smug, expectant smile playing on his lips. He leaned forward as Jae-Hwan entered, but the smile died as he saw who followed behind the boss. Monica walked with her head held high, Seo-Yun cradled in her arms. She didn't look like a maid, a shadow, or a mistress. She looked like a queen mother. Jae-Hwan, Boss O rasped, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and greed. "You bring the distractions into the inner sanctum? Have you lost your mind along with your security?" Jae-Hwan didn't take his seat. He walked to the head of the table, his presence so commanding that the room fell into a suffocating silence. He looked at every man there, his gaze a promise of annihilation for any who dared to breathe. "You all know me as the king of this city," Jae-Hwan began, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls. "You know me as a man without a past and without a future. You thought my strength came from my lack of something to lose." He reached back, and Monica stepped forward. Jae-Hwan took Seo-Yun from her arms, holding the infant with a practiced, protective grace that stunned the room into a second, deeper silence. The baby, waking to the sound of his voice, reached up and grabbed his thumb. "This is Seo-Yun Kang," Jae-Hwan declared, the name ringing out like a strike on an anvil. "Daughter of my brother, Ji-Hoon, my blood, my legacy. And this," he signaled toward Monica, "is the woman who guarded the future of the Kang line while I was too blind to see it. From this day forward, any hand raised against them is a hand raised against me. Any whisper against their honor will be met with the full weight of the dragon." He looked directly at Basso, whose face had turned a sickly shade of gray. "You tried to steal my soul last night, oh. Today, I'm taking your territory. Consider it a tax for the fear you caused my niece." The power in the room shifted instantly. The monsters of Seoul watched as Jae-Hwan stepped away from the table, ignoring the politics and the money, his focus entirely on the child in his arms. He walked out of the chamber, Monica by his side, leaving the syndicate in the dust of his new reality. He had traded his crown of ice for a crown of blood and love. He was still a monster to the world, but as Seo-Yun rested her head against his tattooed neck, he proved that even a monster could be a father.